Everyone, and welcome to Unit 8 within Module 3 on Managing Conflict. There are lots of activities, lots of things to do within this unit, so here will be your brief video lecture that's meant to highlight some of the important parts of this unit and some of the things to pay attention to, but I encourage you to participate fully in the other aspects of this unit, which include the video case, the readings that you have, which are a little lighter for this particular unit, to give you time to participate in the video case dialogue. Also, there's a second video within this unit on the feedback on some of the self-assessment variables that you would have completed earlier in the term. And the feedback there is meant to give you a little bit more insight into where you fit in on a number of the dimensions that we'll talk about. There is a video that accompanies that feedback that is intended to support your interpretation of the material. All right, so let's get started. I want to highlight for you some of the important things to consider when you're thinking about managing conflict, particularly with regards to a leader or a manager or somebody within an organization, how you're supposed to understand the conflict as a way through the conflict. And a first thing that I want to talk about are the types of conflict, recognizing that not all conflict is bad. Often when we think of conflict, we think of negative experiences and negative situations, but that's not always the case. We often think about three types of conflict: relationship-based conflict, task-based conflict, and process-based conflict. As the slide outlines here, relationship-based conflict is when interpersonal incompatibilities exist. This typically happens when there's feelings of tension and friction. So the sense of liking is low, or there's some difficulty, some challenge in between our interactions, our social interactions. That's relationship-based conflict. Then there's task-based conflict. This is differences in viewpoints and opinions pertaining to a task. This is conflict about the work itself, challenges about how things should be, or what the task, the most important features of the task, the outcomes you're trying to achieve, or so on and so forth. These are all task-based conflict issues. Finally, there's process conflict. This is disagreement or controversy about aspects of how task accomplishment will proceed. This is about how we get things done. So if you're engaged in one of these three types of conflicts, you'll have very different experiences. Often relationship-based conflict is very unpleasant. It feels personal, it feels like you're being personally attacked, or it feels you have strong negative emotions towards another individual. And these can really interfere with our ability to work well together. This is in contrast to task-based conflict, which really is about differences in viewpoints and opinions. It's not about you or me, it's about the task itself. So if you are able to see through or see to the source of conflict, often with task conflict, there needn't to be interpersonal conflict. You can still work together well, and you can still get things done. In fact, we know that some amount of task conflict is actually very good for working relationships. And this challenge, this being critical of ideas and trying to really optimize solutions is a way through to high-performing teams. So in order to perform at a high level, we do have to see some task conflict, whereas relationship conflict gets in the way of performance. Finally, process conflict can go either way. So controversy about aspects of how tasks are accomplished, how we'll get things done. This is conflict not about the work itself, nor is it conflict about you or me. It's a conflict about the process that we take together, the route that we take. And so it becomes an important source of conflict because there can be differing ideas on how the work is to be accomplished. Should we take this road or should we take that road? So these are the types of conflict that we often see within organizations. What are the sources of conflict? Well, here are 4 sources that I'd like to highlight for you that are echoed in some of the readings that you're doing for this module or for this unit. The first is the idea of interpersonal conflict. The second is organizational. The third is change or trends. And finally, we have the external environment. All of these things can lead to conflict within organizations. Interpersonal is, again, this idea of tension between individuals. I don't see eye to eye with you. I disagree with you quite often. I don't like you. These types of, the source of conflict is because we rub each other the wrong way. The organization itself can be a source of conflict. Different organizations have different cultures, and different organizations also have different structures. So in a highly hierarchical organization, or in an organization where there are different units that are often pitted against each other, you can think of management union. Those are organizational structures that can be the source of conflict. In the third bullet point here, we have trends or change. I'm sure that you're quite aware that change is something that people often resist within organizations, within workplace environments. So this idea of having something new enter the environment, having people's work experiences be altered or uprooted, can lead to conflict. We often see this when an organization tries to change a practice, or if there's this more significant change effort, a great deal of conflict arises across the different constituents within the environment. So you'll see within our HR program and within other business programs, courses on change management that largely deal with this issue of how do we deal with the negative experiences that come with uncertainty, and uncertainty coming from these times of change. Finally, on this slide, in terms of sources of conflict, we have the external environment. When our organization or experience or our job or our resources are under threat, that is another opportunity for there to be a fair amount of conflict. So the external environment, the pressures that are on us, the competition, can all be sources of conflict. And so I've mentioned that conflict can be both good and bad. So let's talk a little bit more. We understand the types of conflict that exist within organizations. We understand the sources of this conflict. Let's talk for a moment about the outcomes of conflict, the potential outcomes. Well, conflict can lead to both functional and dysfunctional outcomes, as I've noted. The functional outcomes include things like agreement. So it could be that we debate and discuss, and we actually come to an agreement about how things should work. This is a positive thing because our understanding of one another is enhanced, but also because we have had a chance to really question the ideas and work through the problem and determine whether or not we're coming to the best solution. We also might see stronger relationships come out of conflict. We might see that the conflict, the challenge, the trying things out has allowed us to become better working partners, that we understand each other better, and that we work together better. On this sheet, we also have learning as a possible outcome of conflict. Through conflict, I might give you a chance to express your opinions, you will hear my opinions, and we'll learn from one another. Better decisions is another one, and this has to do with a very similar, I'm echoing some ideas that I've already noted a little bit here, the idea that we might be able to optimize a solution through conflict. It might give us a pathway to an ideal solution rather than the first solution that we happen to agree upon. And then decision ownership. The next piece is if we work through the conflict and I disagree with you, but we see it through and we both come to a resolution, we're more likely to both own the outcome and proceed with the decision that we've made, despite the fact that we started from different places. Finally, I'm sure you're familiar with some of the dysfunctional outcomes of conflict. Conflict can often make us defensive, meaning that we feel that we're pushed into a corner and we have to defend ourselves and fight for ourselves. It can make us a bit combative. It can make us competitive. So if this person doesn't agree with me, if there's interpersonal conflict or if there's challenge, I might feel that I'm under threat and that I have to respond by competing or by in some way proving that I'm better. It may cause me to shut down and decrease the amount of information sharing that I take part in, which is can be a real concern. This can lead to something that we call information hiding, where instead of sharing information, we actively limit the amount of information that we share with our colleagues, and really put into jeopardy the types of all of the work we're trying to do as a collective. And it leads to compromised communication. Once you've been in conflict with somebody, it's very difficult to have a good working relationship with them, and to be able to be open and honest, and to go to that individual regularly with problems and issues. You tend to shut down a little bit, and it compromises the channels of communication. So we do know that there are positive and negative outcomes of conflict. So the idea is, within organizations, we do need some conflict. We need conflict in order to optimize ideas, in order to make sure that we're making the best decisions, in order to build relationships. And ideally, we want the type of conflict that supports these outcomes, such as task conflict or sometimes process conflict. So we don't want to avoid conflict. We want to actually work through and with the conflict, but we don't want conflict to cross over into this dysfunctional area where we have all of these negative outcomes. So how should we be managing conflict within organizations? Well, there are many different conflict management styles, and you might look at this board here, or this diagram here, to show some of the possible approaches to conflict. So we have conflict that can be assertive. I'll back up here. On one axis, we have the idea of being assertive. And we've defined assertive here as the motivation to satisfy one's own interests. This can be high or low. On the other axis here, we have cooperativeness, and this is the motivation to satisfy others' interests, and this can be high or low. And within this spectrum, we have identified 5 different conflict management styles. If you are low on both assertiveness and cooperativeness, you avoid conflict. You're not motivated to work through to a resolution. You're actually motivated to not deal with the conflict at all. If you're high on cooperativeness but low on assertiveness, you may have a yielding or accommodating style. In this style, you bend to the will of the other individual. You satisfy the interests of others over your own. If you have a compromising style, you're somewhere in the middle of assertiveness and cooperativeness. Compromising can be helpful because it manages relationships, but it can also undermine ideal solution making. So it can undermine your ability to come to an optimal solution. We have a forcing style. If you are high on assertiveness and low on cooperativeness, this is where you are more competitive and really trying to serve your own self-interests. If you are high on both of these axes, you have what we call a problem-solving or collaborative style. This is where you try to maximize both your own interests and the interests of the other party. This can be quite a challenge because it requires you to be aware of your own interests and hold tight to your own interests, but also try to make sure that you're satisfying the needs of the other party. This is something that actually we talk about a great deal in negotiations and negotiation research. So the alternate video on this, or the self-assessment video on this in this unit, will talk to you about some of the different approaches to negotiations and give you some feedback on the differing ways in which people can approach conflict management through this negotiation framework, this framework of trying to solve problems and be collaborative and walk away from the table having satisfied both your own interests and the interests of others. So let's move on from the conflict management styles and talk for a moment about the factors in choosing the best approach to negotiations. Each situation is quite different, so you'll want to do some assessment of the situation prior to selecting the approach that will work best within a particular conflict resolution situation. First, you'll want to think about the importance of the issue. Is the issue very important, or is the issue not a big deal? Right? You don't want to be terribly competitive or forcing of your solution if the issue is not important. There might be times where you might even consider yielding. How important is the relationship? So we do in negotiations, we talk, because negotiations and conflict management are related concepts. In this literature, we often talk about relationship as being part of what you are negotiating, part of what you are resolving when you sit down at the table to work through an issue with somebody. Relationship importance is always something that should be top of mind when you're dealing with somebody, especially in conflictual situations. If this is an important relationship, if this is a relationship that you, not necessarily a person that you like and want to spend time with socially, but just somebody that you know that you have to work with frequently, somebody that's directly in your environment, somebody whose opinion or whose input matters to the work that you do, you'll want to factor that into the approach that you take. And consider taking an approach that is a little bit more accommodating, maybe problem solving. What is the relative power that you hold relative to the other person? This will also influence your decision-making style. If you are the low power party, you might be ill-advised to seek a more competitive strategy. You might be well advised to understand the limits of your power and to perhaps compromise where needed. Finally, you have to understand the time constraints. Is time a factor in your negotiation or in your conflict situation, which it often is? Do we need to come to a solution? So do we need to work through this conflict in order to get to a solution? Often, when we're balancing problem solving, we balance the importance of the issue against the time to make the decision. And sometimes we might take a shortcut in making a decision in order to make a decent decision, but not at a decent decision without taking up too much time. So there are some decision rules that I think clearly illustrate this idea. Sometimes we choose to use majority rules. We have a vote, and the majority of people, as soon as we get a majority of people agreeing to a certain path, we decide that that's the direction that we'll take. Well, majority rules, the benefit of it is that it doesn't take very much time, but the limit of it is that we don't really hear the minority opinions that might have valuable information, and we also know that people will leave the table unsatisfied. So there are times where we might go for consensus rather than majority rules. But the issue with consensus is it takes a long time to reach a consensus. But we do know that we'll have to hash out all the issues. We'll get all of the inputs onto the table and have an opportunity to make an optimal decision. So you have to understand what you're trying to maximize and optimize in your conflict management in order to know what the best approach will be to coming to a resolution. I want to offer one more piece of organizing information that I find quite useful in resolving disputes. There are different levels that you can use to talk about a dispute. You can talk about the power. So this is the way we're doing it because I'm the boss. You can talk about rights. This is the way we're doing it because this is what the contract says, or this is the agreement we came to, or this, I'm thinking of my own children, this is what you said, Mom, and it's not fair otherwise, right? That's a discussion on rights. Or we can talk about interests. And we talk about interests, what we're talking about is what do you really want to achieve? What do you really want to accomplish? And so we resolve the conflict by focusing on satisfying both of our interests. We often find, especially in interactions that are highly conflictual, you can spend a great deal of time arguing over power and rights and not make any progress until you get to interests. So you have to be able to manage a discussion such that you know where you need to be in order to make progress. Often with conflict, you make the best progress if you are able to focus the discussion on interests. And finally, I'd like to close off by highlighting some other ways to handle conflict. This is where a little bit of emotional intelligence comes in handy. When you are managing conflicts, you want to be able to manage your own emotions, your own approach to the situation. You want to be able to manage the conversation and understand that the process is very important. The words that you select, the things that you choose to say, and the arguments that you choose to make are very important. And you also want to make sure that you are managing the relationship. that you have an eye to whether or not you have an eye to getting through this by not damaging this relationship. You might also need to manage third-party intervention. If you have a mediator, maybe you have a boss or another person within the organization, or maybe you are the other person, you're the manager who's intervening for two people. You always want to have input into how the process that individual takes, and make sure that your interests are aligned with their interests in terms of reaching a resolution. So you want to be able to manage the third party as well. All right, so that is our Unit 8 module on our Unit 8 Module 3, Conflict Management. As I had indicated at the beginning of the video, I encourage you to take part in all of the other aspects of this unit, and I will see you again in Unit 9. Take care.